Story 1. There's a unique kind of silence that settles over a suburban neighborhood after midnight. Pitchforks say it's not an empty silence. It's filled with a low hum of refrigerators, the distant rush of a lone car on the highway, the gentle ticking of a wall clock. It's a comfortable silence, one that promises safety. I grew up with that silence. It was a soundtrack to my late-night study sessions, my video game marathon, and the countless hours I spent feeling like the king of my own quiet castle. I was 19, home from my first year of college for the summer. My parents thrilled to have a break from their empty nest. I had taken a week-long anniversary trip, leaving me in charge of the house. Our home was a 2-story, colonial at the end of the kind of place where the biggest excitement was a neighbor getting a new lawnmower. The backyard was my favorite spot, a perfect square of green bordered by a thick line of woods that separated our property from the next. A single, powerful motion sensor floodlight was mounted above the back door, our only real security measure. For my parents, it was more for scaring off raccoons than people. The first 2 nights were exactly what you'd expect. I ate junk food, ignored my summer reading list, picture, and stayed up until 3 a.m. On the 3rd night, I was at the kitchen table, a textbook open in front of me, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating a pile of half-hearted notes. The only sounds were the soft whir of my computer's fan and the hum of the fridge. That's when it happened. Click. The backyard was instantly bathed in a stark white light. I didn't even look up at first. A deer, a fox, maybe the neighbor's cat. It happened all the time. I took a sip of my cold coffee and went back to reading about After about a minute, the light clicked off, plunging the yard back into darkness. Normal. 5 minutes later, it clicked on again. This time, something felt different. A prickle of awareness on the back of my neck. I looked up and stared out the sliding glass door. The yard was empty. The swing set was still. The trees at the edge of the property were motionless. Still, I watched, my heart beating just a little faster. But the light stayed on. 2 minutes. 3. Motion lights are designed to stay on as long as there's movement. I scanned the yard again, my eyes tracing every shadow. Nothing. Then, as suddenly as it came on, it clicked off. I tried to shake it off, telling myself the sensor was just old and glitchy. But I couldn't focus on my book anymore. I kept glancing at the dark glass door, my own reflection staring back. Our old golden retriever, Busters, who had been sleeping at my feet, let out a low, guttural growl, his eyes fixed on the back door. That's when the real fear started to crawl in. Buster never growled. The light flicked on a 3rd time. I shot up from my chair, my heart now hammering against my rib. Oof. I crept to the door, staying to the side so I wouldn't be seen. The yard was just as empty as before. I stared, my breath fogging up for glass, until my eyes caught something. The little garden gnome my mum kept by the rose bushes. It was moved. It It was facing the house now, its painted on smile, seeming to mock me from across the lawn. I felt a cold dread wash over me. That wasn't a glitch. Playing a game, my hand shaking. I pulled out my phone and opened the app for our security camera, the one that covered the backyard, the same one connected to the motion sensor. I hit live view, expecting to see nothing. There he was, standing perfectly still at the far edge of the yard, almost completely hidden in the shadows of the woods, was the silhouette of a man. He was tall and unnaturally thin, wearing what looked like a long coat despite the warm summer night. I couldn't make out any features, just his shape against the deep black of the forest. He wasn't moving, he was just standing there, watching the house. I felt frozen, my mind racing. I was watching him on my phone, but he was right there, just 50 feet away. My thumb hovered over the button to sound the alarm, but I hesitated. What if it made him rush the house? I decided to call the police. I backed away from the glass door, keeping my eyes locked on the phone screen, and moved silently into the living room to dial 911. As I was whispering to the dispatcher, I glanced back at the screen, and my blood ran cold. The figure was moving. He was walking slowly, deliberately, not towards the house, but parallel to it, along the tree line. Then he stopped, turned his head, and seemed to look directly at the small, blinking red light of the security camera. He knew I was watching. Bah! He lifted a hand, a long, pale hand, and waved. A slow, mocking wave. The dispatcher was telling me officers were on their way, to stay on the line and lock myself in a room. I ran upstairs, Buster at my heels, and locked myself in my parents' bathroom, the only room without windows. I sat there on the floor, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the silence of the house, which was now a terrifying, heavy thing. The police arrived in what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes. They swept the yard with their flashlights, their voices cutting through the night. They found nothing. No man, no long coat. Just a single set of deep footprints in the soft soil near the woods, leading in and then back out. When they asked me to show them the gnome, we all went outside. It was back in its original spot, facing the rose bushes, its cheerful, painted face a grotesque reminder of the night's events. The police report chalked it up to a likely prankster, a trespasser who was scared off. But I know what I saw. I saw someone who wasn't just passing through. He was observing. He was testing. And the scariest part, the part that still keeps me up at night, is that he knew I was watching him watch me. I never felt safe in that house again. The silence of the suburbs was no longer a comfort. It was a warning, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying thing in the world is simply knowing someone's outside. The story, they say, isolation can play tricks on the mind. when you're miles from your nearest neighbor, surrounded by nothing but whispering fields of corn and an endless sky. Every snap of a twig and every rustle of leaves can sound like an approaching threat. My wife, Chloe, and I learned that lesson the hard way during our first year in the old farmhouse we'd bought in rural Iowa. We wanted to escape the city to find peace in the quiet expanse of the heartland. We found something else entirely. The house was a 2-story relic, sturdy and weathered, with a wraparound porch and a big red barn out back. It was our dream, but on a Tuesday night in October, that dream became a nightmare. A storm had been brewing all day, and by 9 p.m. it hit with a vengeance. Rain lashed against the windows in horizontal sheets, and the wind howled like a hungry animal. The power had been flickering for an hour, each brownout plunging us into a heart-stopping moment of darkness before the lights sputtered back to life. We were in the living room, a fire roaring in the hearth, doing our best to ignore the violent symphony outside. Our dog, a jumpy border collie named Finn, was pacing nervously by the front door. Suddenly, he froze, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Chloe looked at me, her eyes wide. "What is it, boy?" "Brew." And then we heard it, over the roar of the wind and the drumming of the rain. There was another sound. Knock, knock, knock. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was at our front door. We looked at each other in disbelief. We were a 10-mile drive from the main road, down a muddy, unpaved lane. No one came out here by accident, especially not in a storm like this. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, my heart pounding, and crept to the door. I peered through the peephole. A man stood on our porch, drenched and illuminated by the flashes of lightning. He was gaunt, with slick, dark hair, plastered to his skull, and deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb the light. He wasn't looking at the door, but past it, as if trying to see inside. He wore a thin, soaked button-down shirt, completely inadequate for the weather. I cracked the door open, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Can I help you?" I yelled over the storm. His head snapped towards me, his eyes locking onto mine. He didn't look panicked or distressed, just empty. "Car broke down," he said, his voice flat and monotone, barely audible. "Need to use a phone." It was the oldest line in the book. My gut screamed at me. "Sorry, our phone line's down with the storm," I laughed. "I can't help you." I expected him to argue, to plead. He did nothing. He just stood there, water dripping from his chin, staring at me through the crack in the door. The silence stretched on, broken only by the storm and Finn's frantic barking. "You should get back to your car," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Come by in the morning." I went to close the door. He suddenly slammed his hand against it, the wood groaning. "Let me in," he said, his voice no longer flat, but a low, chilling command. I slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. My hands were trembling. "Chloe, go upstairs, lock the door." I shouted. The knocking started again. Harder this time, turning into a rhythmic, violent pounding that shook the entire door frame. Ben was going ballistic, throwing himself against the door, and then, with a final, dying flicker, the lights went out for good. We were plunged into absolute darkness. The pounding stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain and our own panicked breaths. I thought maybe he'd given up. Maybe the darkness had scared him off. But then a new sound began. A sound far more terrifying than the knocking. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the sound of something being dragged along the wooden siding of the house. It was moving. Who was circling the house, slowly, deliberately. I grabbed Chloe and we backed into the kitchen. The fireplace poker held out in front of me like a sword. The scraping sound moved past the living room windows, then faded as he rounded the corner to the back of the house. We stood there, in the dark, listening, and then we heard it. The distinct, sickening sound of shattering glass from the small window in the laundry room at the far end of the house. P.U. was inside. We didn't wait. We scrambled up the stairs in the dark, fumbling our way into our bedroom and slamming the heavy oak door. I shoved a dresser in front of it while Chloe called 911 on her cell phone, her voice a terrified whisper. She told them what was happening, that there was an intruder, and gave them our address. The dispatcher promised help was on the way, but warned that the storm would make it slow going. Fuck. We then heard the footsteps downstairs. Slow, heavy, waterlogged footsteps moved through our home as if they owned it. We could hear him opening cupboards and dragging chairs. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't searching. It felt like he was exploring, taunting us. We huddled in the corner of our room for what felt like a lifetime, listening to the man move through our house below. With the footsteps eventually made their way to the bottom of the stairs. They paused. Then, one slow, creaking step at a time, he began to ascend. Just as he reached the top of the landing, we saw the blessed flash of red and blue lights cutting through the darkness outside. Sirens were faint, but they were there. The footsteps stopped. There was a moment of silence, then a crash from downstairs, as he must have realized the police were arriving. We heard a door slam, and then nothing. The deputies found the broken laundry room window and muddy footprints all through the kitchen and living room. They found a trail leading from our back door into the endless, dark cornfields. They searched for hours but found no one. They never found a broken-down car on the main road or on our lane. It was as if he had just materialized out of the storm itself. We sold the farmhouse that spring. We couldn't stay. Every time it rained, every time the wind howled, we couldn't shake the memory of that night. The peace we had sought in the countryside was gone, replaced by the chilling knowledge that sometimes, when someone's outside, the storm isn't the most dangerous thing you have to worry about. Story 3. When you live in a city, you trade one kind of safety for another. You give up the peace of a quiet neighborhood for the security of anonymity, of being surrounded by a million other people. You accept the noise and the crowds, and in return, you get locks, doormen, and floors of solid concrete between you and the street. We lived on the 10th floor of a high-rise in Chicago. For me, someone's outside meant a noisy neighbor in the hallway, or a party on the roof. The idea of a threat appearing on my balcony, 100 feet in the air, was absurd. It was impossible. I'm a graphic designer, and I often work late into the night, my world shrinking to the glow of my monitor. My apartment was my sanctuary, a modern, minimalist space with a huge wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that led out to a small balcony. It overlooked a sea of city lights, a beautiful, impersonal view that always made me feel safe and detached. One night in February, a cold, bitter wind was rattling the city. I was deep in a project, and the only light in the apartment was coming from my screen. It was around 2 a.m. when I first heard it. A soft thump against the glass. I dismissed it as the wind throwing a piece of ice or debris against the window. It was an old building. It made noises. A few minutes later, I heard it again, but this time it was different. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching. Scritch, scritch. It was slow, deliberate, and coming from the balcony door. I froze, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. My logical mind tried to find an explanation. A bird, a loose cable from the satellite dish on the roof, tapping in the wind. But the sound was too intentional. I muted my music and listened. The scratching stopped. The only sound was the wind. I told myself I was just tired and overworked, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I got up and walked slowly towards the windows. The vertical blinds were drawn, but there were small gaps. I peered through one of them. The balcony was empty, covered in a thin layer of grimy, windswept snow. Nothing. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and went back to my desk, feeling foolish. I tried to work, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I kept glancing back at the windows. That's when I noticed a smudge on the glass of the balcony door, right at eye level. It looked like the greasy print left by a forehead pressed against the pane. But how? I felt a genuine spike of fear. I stood up again, and this time I pulled the cord to open the blinds. Just an inch. My heart pounding. The balcony was still empty, but the smudge was definitely there. And below it, I could see faint, swirling marks in the thin layer of frost on the glass. Like someone had been breathing there for a long time. I slammed the blinds shut and backed away, my mind scrambling. There was no way up. The balconies weren't connected. There was no ladder, no scaffolding. It was a sheer 10-story drop to the alley below. It had to be my imagination. I sat back down at my desk, trying to force myself to be rational. I turned on a lamp, flooding the room with warm light, and put on my headphones, cranking up the music to drown out the wind and my own thoughts. I worked for another hour, forcing the image out of my mind. Finally exhausted, I saved my project and shut down my computer. The screen went black, turning into a dark, reflective mirror. And in that reflection, for a split second, I saw it. Behind me, reflected in the monitor, was the window. And in the window was a face. It was pale and gaunt, with wide, dark eyes and stringy, wet-looking hair. Bare, it was pressed against the glass, its features distorted. It wasn't a smudge or a trick of the light. It was a person on my 10th floor balcony, looking at. The reflection was there for only a second before I spun around in my chair with a strangled cry. The balcony was empty. I didn't scream. I couldn't. All the air had been punched out of my lungs. I was paralyzed, staring at the empty space where that horrifying face had been. Was I losing my mind? Had I finally pushed myself too far with work and caffeine? Then I heard it again. Scritch, scritch, scritch. This time, it wasn't on the glass. It was on the metal frame of the door, the sound of fingernails trying to find a purchase, trying to pull it open, that broke the paralysis. I scrambled for my phone, my fingers fumbling with the screen. I called 911, babbling about a man on my balcony. The operator was calm, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice. "Ma'am, you're on the 10th floor." "Yes, I know. It sounds crazy, but he's here. He's trying to get in." She dispatched a car. I grabbed a heavy kitchen knife and stood in the middle of my living room, my back to the wall, watching the balcony door. The scratching stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. When the police finally knocked on my apartment door, I nearly jumped out of my skin. They came in, 2 of them, looking professional but clearly expecting a false alarm. I explained what happened, pointing at the balcony door. One of them went over, unlocked it, and slid it open. He stepped out with his flashlight, sweeping it across the small space and over the edge. He came back in, shaking his head. "Nothing out there, ma'am. No footprints in the snow, and no scuff marks on the railing. No way anyone could have gotten up here." I felt my sanity start to fray. Was it all in my head? B were kind, but they treated me like a hysterical woman who had let her imagination run wild. They left, advising me to get some rest. I didn't sleep that night. Or the next. I ended up breaking my lease and moving to a 3rd-floor apartment in a different part of the city, one with no balcony. I never told anyone the full story again, because I know how it sounds, but I also know what I saw. I don't know how he got up there, or what he was. I know that the safety of 10 floors of concrete is just an illusion, and sometimes the thing that's outside isn't on the ground. It's right there at your window, waiting for you to look away for just a second.